welcome to the program. Today, we'll be attempting a review of Africa's relationship with the United Nations and redefining what the future of that relationship must look like to fully benefit the continent. The relationship I speak of can be traced back to 1960, when 15 African countries gained independence and 17 became UN member states. Now, right off, to help remove the stain of colonialism, the UN embarked on an effort to assist these newly independent African countries to establish democratic governments. Many of these countries lacked familiarity with the democratic structures. They were plagued by ethnic conflict and faced internal struggles over access to political power and resources. These conflicts led to the establishment of the first peacekeeping mission on the African continent in what is now known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, with the support of 20,000 troops. Now, speed dial some 6 decades after. Despite many Nobel Peace Prize for its efforts, evaluations of the organization's effectiveness have been missed. Some critics argue that not enough has been achieved. As they say, Africa still suffers from chronic political instability, poverty, hunger, and disease. Some even claim the UN is ineffective, biased, or corrupt. Now, one of the grounds for the many complaints is the inability of the international community to reach a consensus on the restructuring of the composition of the UN Security Council. The feeling is that since the Council devotes a lot of its time and energy to African problems, Africa ought to be appropriately represented in the permanent membership of the Council, in order to make more effective its case at the Council. Now, this particular sentiment was re-echoed quite recently by Senegalese President Macky Sall and South African President Cyril Ramaphosa when they denounced what they described as unfair representation of Africa in the UN Security Council, regretting that no African country is a permanent member. How can Africa overcome these structural challenges among the plethora of issues at the UN to make her voice more effective? My guest today is Gustavo De Carvalho, an experienced public policy researcher and consultant with 15 years of experience in diverse and high-level policy, capacity building, and research environments related to multilateralism and international organizations in the Global South. He worked as a coordinator at the African Center for Constructive Resolution of Disputes in Durban, South Africa, and as a researcher at Global Witness in London. Gustavo holds a master's degree in African Studies from the University of Oxford and a bachelor's in International Relations from the University of Brasilia. Thank you very much for joining us on One Slot.
Thank you very much for having me, Felicity.
The UN has won notable prize for her effort and, arguably the foremost vehicle for international cooperation. Yet, as I've mentioned earlier, some describe it as ineffective in Africa. Do you share in that sentiment? What are some of the priorities of the UN in dealing with Africa? And I know it's three-pronged. How would you assess their efforts so far?
Thanks so much. I think it's the catch-22 question and the million-dollar question for all of us working in this field. But certainly the United Nations has played an important role in the continent through the deployment of peacekeepers, through the engagement with mediation, and especially in the recent decades to support countries that are coming out of conflicts to build the structures for sustainable peace. But that being said, it doesn't mean that the United Nations doesn't have its challenges. The institution has this massive bureaucracy and this massive political enterprise has shown a lot of sluggish responses and difficulties of adapting its own systems to be able to better respond to the needs of the continent. Part of the challenge is presented, as you mentioned earlier, in regards to the change of its own political organs, the UN Security Council being the most obvious of them, and this structure that still reminds us the end of Second World War and does not fully reflect the different power compositions that we have in the world today. So to some extent, we still need to acknowledge the role that it plays and the importance that it plays in supporting countries, particularly when it comes to issues around peace and security. But it's not to say that it doesn't need to change. You mentioned a history around peacekeeping operations, and there is much evidence that shows that peacekeeping operations often provide support, and peacekeeping operations can help reducing levels of violence in conflicts. But that doesn't mean that it's the only tool that the UN should use at its disposal. In recent years, we've seen many peacekeeping operations leaving the continent to what we call some of the transitions from outside of peacekeeping operations. But at that time, many of us, and including the United Nations, are still struggling to identify what are the best tools that we can utilize to provide effective solutions for conflicts in the continent, but also globally. What we need to see then is what are some of the African thinking within those institutions? How can the experiences coming from the continent can effectively support the development of tools that are not just a cookie cutter that are presented in one place and copy and pasted to the other, but are also that are reflective to the needs on the ground, reflective of the situations. But in order to do that, the institution needs to be more nimble. The institution needs to be more reactive, and the institution needs to adapt as a means to ensure that the responses that we need are well implemented on the ground.
Now, I'd like to explore your thinking on the African thinking inside the UN. I'd like you to talk about that, while you also talk about the kind of relationship that currently exists between the UN and Africa.
We need to remember that the United Nations, there's 55 African member states that are part of the United Nations. So sometimes we talk about the UN as the outside talking to the continent, but in reality, 28% of all members of the United Nations are African member states. And that is an important starting point, because at the end of the day, if those 54 member states are able to come with a common voice, they're able to influence and to bring those numbers, they can become far more influential. And we've seen in recent years how this unity, which is not always possible and is not always seen, but when it does happen, when it is possible, you provide a continent with a much stronger voice. But the other element of that is that we have a very unique continental institution and regional organizations within Africa. We have the African Union, we have ECOWAS, we have SADC, we have IGAD, and many other institutions that with all of their flaws and challenges, and I think many of us acknowledge that these organizations are often fractured in the way that they respond, they have been able to engage in different ways. They have been able to identify and respond when the rest of the international community has not been willing to do so. So this provides the continent a strong opportunity to gain more leverage. This provides the opportunity of ensuring that African responses for African challenges is not just a motto where Africans are claiming to ostracize the rest of the international community to respond to its own challenges. In reality, African solutions to African challenges came as this idea in the late 90s and early 2000s as the African realization that when the international community, which we are part of, is not willing or able to respond, we also have a responsibility to do so. And largely, a lot of these experiences have influenced the way that the United Nations has responded. We've seen in recent years in the Sahel, in East Africa, and even now more recently in Southern Africa with the experience in Mozambique, where there is a strong partnership between African institutions and the rest of the international community. And I've argued that in a paper a few months ago, that the future of multilateralism in Africa is African. But now the continent needs to be able to claim that space and claim ownership for some of its solutions and be able to contribute to global discussions.
Okay, I'm going to ask you about something you said. It was supposed to be much later, but you've brought it up, and that's the African response to crisis in the continent. And we know that the UN is sort of, gravitating towards them first for sort of solutions. There is a question about the willingness of Africa to solve its own problem, might be providing, I'm not sure if I'm phrasing it well, might be providing an excuse for international community like the UN to shrink on its responsibility, because it is, however you look at it, the foremost vehicle for cooperation, international cooperation. What's your thinking there?
You're absolutely correct with that. We've seen, at least since the 1990s, when conflicts changed a lot in dynamics, a great change in this commitment gap between countries from the global north and mostly developed countries and countries from the global south, including a lot of African member states, where you have countries from the global north that largely pay for many of the interventions. If we see the reliance of the African Union and many of the regional economic communities to external funding, but at the end of the day, the continent is the one deploying troops on the ground. The continent still provides majority of the peacekeepers that we have on the ground. And that commitment gap shows a high degree of hypocrisy of the international community, where we expect and we see many of the conflicts in the continent, and the Security Council identifies many of them as threats to international peace and security, which are collective requirements and collective commitments that should be made by the international community. But at the end of the day, African organizations and African member states tend to be much faster in deploying that. What we've seen in the last 10 years in particular is that African regional responses have taken a lot of the forefront of what types of mechanisms and tools that are being deployed in the continent. Whether we talk about the G5 Sahel, whether we talk about the multinational joint task force to fight against Boko Haram, whether we're talking more recently about the deployment from SADC to Mozambique. These are not simply African member states competing with the United Nations, but rather responding to the inability and what I've mentioned earlier, to often the sluggish response that we see from the UN Security Council in dealing with crisis in Africa and in other parts of the world.
And that's the question now, isn't it? How Africa can be a bit more integrated in the decision-making process, maybe to speed up how responses get to Africa. There is a perception that the UN is contributing to the impression that it is promoting few superpower interests to that of the African continent, specifically colonial masters. Where I'm going to is your thinking on the clamor for permanent seat in the UN by Africans.
I think there is 2 points that are important to reflect in that. And one of them is what role is Africa playing in the current situation within the UN Security Council? Because even though, and I will talk a bit about the reform processes that are very important, but there is much the member states within the Security Council can actually do in order to make their voice better heard. African member states generally have a very low impact when it comes to some of these global geostrategic discussions. Ukraine, and we're probably going to be talking about Ukraine just now.
Yes,
it's one of the most obvious examples where African voices are somehow not only muted, but are difficult to be heard. But we've seen, and I've worked with UN Security Council for over a decade, and we've seen that when African member states come together with joint positions within the UN Security Council on African issues, their leverage and ability to change courses of discussions is very high. An example of that was in 2019 in the discussions in the crisis in Sudan that led to the al-Bashir fall, where African member states were incredibly effective of ensuring that the African positions from the African Union were heard within the UN Security Council. And to some extent, were able to maneuver some of these rushed positions that the West was looking to have at that particular point, but also bringing Russia and China closer to the African position based on the fact there was a continental position. So the ability of having leverage through common positions has shown, especially in the last 5 years, a great asset for the continent in changing the discussions. But now it brings to the core of your question, should the UN Security Council be reformed? And the simple question is, yes, it has to be reformed due to the fact that it has been acknowledged for decades already that it does not reflect the current balance of power in the world. Considering there's 1.2 billion Africans, citizens, 54 member states, over 70% of UN Security Council resolutions being focused in Africa, it seems to me a common sense that an African member state or several African member states should be part as permanent members. But we also need to understand that one of the reasons why the predecessor of the United Nations failed is when it tried to avoid seeing the imbalance of power that exists globally. We want a strong United Nations, but we also want the powers and all of the countries of the United Nations to remain part of it. But how do we ensure that this is done in a manner that contributes effectively to the role that it's placed for the United Nations under its UN Charter? That it talks about precisely avoiding conflicts as the core entry point for the institution. But is that something that can be done in between if we don't really get the momentum for that? There is a lot that can be done. The UN Security Council, to some degree, is a very high-level political organ. But we forget sometimes the importance of permanence, of having your own missions in New York that are dealing with a lot of issues on a day-to-day basis. Because part of the power of the P5 or the 5 permanent members of the Security Council is that they understand this very bureaucratic and procedural organ better than anyone else. And in that sense, when African countries and countries that are not permanent members at large are able to learn from one another. They're able to create priorities and strategies that are effective for those 2 years that they are when they are non-permanent members. They can still make a great impact, but they should still, like many African member states have been doing, continually claiming for the changes within the structure of the United Nations Security Council. Even if I feel at this stage there is not enough momentum within the P5 to engage in a serious discussion. Unlike what we've seen, for instance, in 2005 and 2006, right now, if there is one thing, sadly, that the permanent members are unified within the UN Security Council, is the reluctance of changing the structure of that. So it is the responsibility of the non-permanent members and the other 178 member states of the United Nations to continue pushing this discussion in the agenda until they're able to make some change.
This question might sound very naive, but just for clarification purposes, why the hesitancy to give, to allow equal participation in the decision-making body as important as the UN Security Council?
I don't think it's a naive question. I think it's a very, very important question because effectively it shows that member states with power don't want to delegate their power to someone else. That is the challenge of that when you delegate part of your sovereignty to an organization like the United Nations and ensuring that that organization is still somehow responding to your needs and interests. What most countries do and all of the member states of the United Nations, they create a point of negotiation and bargain. But when you are a permanent member of the UN Security Council, which gives you a veto power, where it gives you a say in every single major peace and security situation that is happening in the world, it's really hard for you to want to delegate that to someone else because you then you provide in your own interest and future to countries that are outside of this little club.
Well, what does that now say about, sorry to interrupt you, if this is the sentiment that is prevailing, what does that now say about the organization itself, which is supposed to be a cohesive a vehicle that brings cooperation among world leaders? There seems to be a continuous power play. That means some people are still looking for leverage to sort of control other aspects of the world. Isn't that something that, I mean, every right-thinking person should kick against if they truly want to make the world better?
Yeah, I don't want to be very cynical in my analysis, but I think we do need to remind ourselves that the United Nations is not an apolitical organization. It is an organization that it's part of international politics, and countries are going to play whichever cards they can in order to contribute to particular outcomes that the institution does. Does it mean that the institution is not important? No. Does it mean that the work that the institution does is not relevant? Certainly not. But what we've seen for quite some time now is an organization that is at a crossroads. There is its own legitimacy and credibility amongst the population and even amongst member states themselves. It's particularly problematic. We have this lockdown that did not start in Ukraine. The standstill of decisions that are becoming harder and harder to be made is something that we've seen for at least 1 decade in the United Nations, which should provide member states the opportunity, the impetus, and the responsibility to engage in serious discussions on what type of the United Nations we want. If we don't have a United Nations that it's able to respond to crisis situations like we see currently in many parts of the continent, like we see in Ukraine, like we see in parts of Asia and the Middle East and Latin America, we're going to have an organization that is far less utilized and see it as a credible actor to resolve those. So at the end of the day, there is a need for those changes to happen. And African member states, by the sheer numbers of having 28%, 54 member states out of 192 members, should be able to more seriously engage in those discussions and provide concepts and norms that benefit the continent itself, but also in a smart way, understanding that the institution will always be political. It's not something that we're ever going to be able to avoid. But we know there are ways in which countries can actually become more relevant, more visible. Few examples. We've seen many tiny countries within the UN Security Council that have played quite an important role. Nordic countries, Uruguay, St. Vincent and Grenadines. These are tiny, tiny countries that effectively have been able to contribute to discussions, particularly because they understood well what we could put on the table. They understood well the process of prioritization, that you cannot choose every single issue as a priority if you're not able to pursue them. Not every country is going to have over 100 personnel based in New York like the United States.
Okay. I'm sorry, I have to interject because I'm actually enjoying so much what you're saying that forgetting there are other aspects that we need to also cover. To start off, a lot has been written in commemoration of UN 75th year. That's in 2020, I believe. And one in particular I'd like to mention is in regard to peacekeeping was from Mark Kogan. He was a former communications specialist with the UN in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. He said that the peacekeeping mission in Africa has been, let me use this word, a miserable failure because it is tied to the whims of Security Council, which is less and less capable of performing its basic function. He's of the opinion that Africa has not been well served by the UN. What's your thinking when it comes to peacekeeping in Africa and the role the UN is playing with it?
It is certainly an interesting take to United Nations peacekeeping operations and to some extent reflects what the United Nations have been doing for quite a few decades. Peacekeeping operations today is not the same what they were in the 1960s. And you mentioned the MONUC, which was the mission in the Congo in the 1960s. Peacekeeping operations have largely evolved from being very small, from being very much focused on this idea of buffer areas to monitor peace agreements, to increasingly work towards developing conditions that enable national parties to take over security on the ground. Have we had problems? Many. Have we had changes? Certainly. And I think there is a lot of evidence that is coming out from the research and the policy circles that do show that in countries where peacekeeping operations have been deployed, there is a certain degree of reduction of violence that occurs with that. But we still have many of these missions, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where we have a peacekeeping operation on the ground since 1999, and it's still an ongoing situation of crisis, which shows to me that the problem is not simply about peacekeeping operations. We created a space in which peacekeeping became somehow of a panacea, that is this tool that you use for any particular situation. And of course, those missions will not always be successful. There are other things that the United Nations, national actors, civil society organizations, or regional organizations can and should be doing to ensure that peace is sustainable. There is many things that can be done beyond this deployments of very heavy footprint missions with thousands of troops on the ground, considering the conflicts are political. And this is part of the evolution where I would like to see peacekeeping operations going in the future, that it becomes just another tool for the international community in dealing with conflicts, that ensures that more nimble, more tailored, more politically savvy responses can effectively support countries. Because otherwise, we're just going to be doing patchwork. We're going to be able to do a peace agreement, deploy some troops to go on the ground and a bunch of civilians that are in the field for a number of years. But as soon as they leave, conflict returns. And that shows that we cannot only rely on one tool as the solution for the conflicts in the continent. And to a large extent, ensuring that member states understand that they should not really be thinking like business as usual when they are thinking about how to intervene and how to respond in conflict situations.
All right. I really believe we should come back to the issue of peacekeeping. Your perspective is a bit different from some that I saw. But what we have done so far is establish what the current relationship between Africa and the UN looks like. When we return from this very short breather, here my guest will be helping us paint a picture of what the relationship should look like if Africa is to optimize its partnership with the UN. And we're going to start with peacekeeping. Don't go away. Good to know you're still with us. We still have Gustavo speaking with us on the relationship that Africa has with the UN. We're trying to redefine how it should be. Before we went on that break, I really had to interrupt you, but I want you to speak a little more on the whole idea of peacekeeping in Africa. It seems to take precedence, like you've mentioned, over every other aspect that we should be looking at.
Absolutely. And I think we've seen the trends in the last 15 to 20 years when we've started seeing these types of peacekeeping operations, is that often when we have a crisis situation in the continent, and particularly when you have a certain degree of agreement between the parties, or at least some of the parties, is that the tool that we utilize most often is the tools of deploying peacekeeping operations. However, some of the challenges of doing that is that often these peacekeeping operations are not well equipped of dealing with things that are not necessarily military solutions. How do we respond to problems that are intrinsically political, that require civilians to promote confidence building and mediation? How do you build institutions that enable those conflicts not to start with? So this idea of having peacekeeping as one of the tools, but also connected to strong conflict prevention and post-conflict reconstruction and development, but what we tend to call as peace building initiatives, are equally important. But in order to deal with them, we need different structures. We often need structures that are probably smaller with different type of personnel, and that it changes a lot of the way in which the planning and thinking occurs. If you are planning for a very heavy footprint peacekeeping operation in a country like Mali, you have to think about the deployment of troops, the expansion of the extension of a lot of these operations, which are often incredibly expensive. But there is many other tools that you can utilize that are developed and deployed in a collaborative manner with national actors and other external actors that can be highly effective in ensuring the sustainability of peace. And we probably are now in 2022 in an important space to reflect again about them. Many peacekeeping operations in Africa have either closed in transition or are underway to do that. We see the examples of the mission in Sudan and in Darfur or in Somalia, or even discussions in the DRC that really provides us this reflection, what comes after peacekeeping operations, considering that we know that after a conflict, the chances of a conflict to reemerge is very high. Most countries that come out of a conflict to some extent end up returning to a degree of violence. And that is not simply the role of peacekeeping operations to do. But the other part of the discussion is that peacekeeping operations themselves have changed as well. While the United Nations really have struggled to deploy what we call these robust missions, or missions with the power and the ability of utilize powers, we've seen that regional arrangements or regional organizations tend to be far more well positioned to deploy troops in spaces where it's not simply about negotiation of the parties. The example of Somalia, the example of the G5 Sahel, the example of the multinational joint task force in relation to Boko Haram, all show that these regional organizations have not really taken the space of the United Nations. They created a whole new way of seeing and deploying their own troops in a manner that we would see as almost impossible for the Security Council to approve, which creates a space for the future of peacekeeping that it's a future of partnerships, that the United Nations will probably never be able to do all of the responses by itself. The important partnership between the UN, the African Union, ECOWAS, SADC, ECAS, IGAD, and many other regional economic communities in the continent is at the core of the discussions of the responses of the international community. But we need to understand this is not about leaving Africans alone to resolve these issues. The Security Council acknowledged that most conflict situations in Africa are threats to international peace and security. Therefore, there is a responsibility of the international community to provide support for these institutions to be able to better deploy. Okay. So when we talk about this, it's not about Africans begging for money or Africans really requiring this kind of support from the rest of the international community.
This will take us
shared responsibility.
What you just said will take us back to the conversation around Africa getting a permanent seat in the Security Council. How can we begin? A lot of persons think it's a pipe dream. It's not possible, in spite of the agitation by presidents like that of Senegal and South Africa. But how, in your thinking, you've really worked in this aspect for a very long time? Is it achievable, and how can we begin to inch towards it?
I think being based in South Africa, I wanted to use a quote from Nelson Mandela, where it said it seemed impossible until it was done. And certainly there is this idea of politically being very difficult to be able to engage in a serious conversation that would enable that. But at the end of the day, we need to remember that around 17 years ago, there was a strong momentum and discussions around UN reforms. What I think African member states need to be doing are two things. One is internally continue with discussions, what type of modalities do we want as a continent in a revitalized and in a reformed UN Security Council. Despite we having there's a winning consensus of 2006, we still don't have a lot of clarity amongst African member states on who would be the right candidate and or candidates for that. And I think that is the first part of the conversation. But the second issue, I think it's something that of consistency of keep bringing this issue on the table, providing discussions and ensuring that this thing is continuously mentioned until the point there is a ripened moment for that reform to occur. I think there is a space for us to reflect on the importance and the future role of multilateral institutions. And the more these institutions lose perceived or real legitimacy amongst the international community, the more that space needs to be there. But African member states need to be opportunistic, not in a negative sense, but they need to see the opportunity that may not come in a month or in a year, but it's still a space in which when it comes on a serious discussion and a serious momentum for the change of the structure of the UN Security Council, that they're well positioned to effectively contribute to the outcomes of that discussion that particularly benefits the African continent.
Okay, I want to take you back to, before I do that though, let's talk about what kind of changes we're likely to see. I mean, let's anticipate if that becomes a reality, what kind of changes we'll see if we get a permanent seat in the United Nations. And then after that, I hope you remember, I'll remind you. I want to take us back to something you said earlier about our responses, African responses to conflict, that to the point that the international community sort of defers to us. I'm not sure if I heard if that is a good thing, but is that such a bad thing if Africans begin to, grow independent of the need for that cooperation if the permanent seat seems to seem so far away?
I think on the first question and in terms of what we expect to see changing, and that's certainly a difficult question because there is so many different ideas that float around. But I think the main rationale for that is to make the Security Council more representative of the current situation of the international community. We only had 4 African member states that were members of the United Nations in 1945, and we moved to 54 now into 2022. So certainly the role that Africa plays in global in global politics is much higher right now. So what we would expect to see is to see a variety of voices, not only from Africa, but also from other parts of the world that have been claiming that for a number of decades. But we also can understand that there are other ways to what some analysts call the soft reforms of the UN Security Council. One of the things that non-permanent members often complain when they are part of the UN Security Council is how taxing the bureaucracy and the procedural elements of the Security Council is for non-permanent members. To a large degree, we see permanent members not only having the veto power, but often having what we call the pen holdership. Having the pen in the UN Security Council, these are the countries that generally initiate resolutions. They put the language that they want, and that provides them a lot of power in terms of the outcomes of these resolutions. And this is something that non-permanent members, including African non-permanent members within what we call the A3 or the 3 African member states in the UN Security Council have been claiming a lot of that. There is a very uneven division of labor between the permanent members and the non-permanent members. There is a number of subsidiary organs like sanctions and subsidiary organs that discuss specialized issues that they tend to be managed by the non-permanent members. It means that when you have a very small mission, a very small diplomatic presence in New York, like many small countries, your limited human resources capacity is already more problematic because you need to provide more resources to be able to monitor issues that are largely administrative. So there are ways that we can empower non-permanent members even without the bigger political reform of the council. We need to think better of who are the ones that are creating the language in relation to the resolutions that are being approved. We need to empower non-permanent members to be able to share their voices in a more constructive manner, that they're not having this administrative burden that really impacts the ability of making their voice heard. And at the end of the day, we need to ensure that the responses of the UN Security Council are more reflective of the dynamics of the international community in 2022, not the reflection of what the international community was in 1945 when the UN was created. And what was your other question?
I was asking for the response. African continent is responding to conflict in their own way. You even highlighted some of the unique packages with peacekeeping. So I'm asking, is that such a bad thing for us to consider, considering the issues around getting permanent decision-making position in the larger body of the UN? Or is it that we're not yet independent enough to go that route?
I think it all comes on the idea of agency and ownership. And to a large extent, I think it is a great thing that African member states have stepped up in the last 20 years since the African Union was created, and generates this whole regime and system within the continent that it's somehow able to respond to crises when they come. This idea of African solutions to African problems, for me, is complementary to the responsibility of the international community in the continent. The idea of African solutions to African problems provides the understanding, the conceptual, practical, strategic, and operational understanding that Africans can have in identifying responses that are different to those and complementary to those of the rest of the international community. Okay. But also it shows that agency and ownership is not a given. No one is going to give agency and ownership to Africans themselves. Africa as a continent needs to claim that space if they want to be influential in global politics. Okay,
let me interject here and ask about the accomplishment of African member states within the UN. What are some of them, and how can we leverage what they've been able to achieve going forward? If you can do that maybe in about a minute, we still have a whole lot of areas to cover.
I wanted to be very brief, but I think there is one example that we've noticed as researchers in the last 5 years is the attempt of African member states to become more cohesive within the UN Security Council. For many years, it was very hard to see a cohesive African group and what we call, as I mentioned earlier, the A3, and the increasing number of joint statements, joint positions, and that push that the A3 has pursued to have in the last 5 years have been incredibly beneficial for the continent and for its own voices. Is it perfect? No. Can it always be done? No. But when that was possible, we saw very tangible results of how African voices were able to provide a continent leverage within the UN Security Council and the collaboration between those member states and the African Union in Addis Ababa.
All right, we certainly are not done with the conversation. There are emerging issues when it comes to what is going on, the dynamics with the war in Ukraine, and the Africa UN vote on Russia to be discussed after we come back from this very short break. I hope we have enough time to cover. Just stay with us. Glad you're still with us. This conversation, like I said, will be incomplete if we do not talk about the reactions of African nations to the ongoing war in Ukraine. Now, in a piece you co-authored recently for the Institute for Security Studies, you questioned if certain African members are becoming more aligned to Russia's positions on the Security Council. And since the war began, many have been intrigued by the response from different African countries as reflected in their UN vote on Russia's invasion. Please share some of the insight as to why there is a lack of overwhelming condemnation for Russia's action and how this, in fact, reflects on Africa.
Thank you very much. And I think there is two angles that we can look into this approach. One of them, and it's probably what has been mostly explored by the media and many academics, are the relationships of some of African member states with Russia itself, whether it's through economics, whether it's through arms trades, whether it's about historical relationship between some liberation movements in the continent and the old Soviet Union. But I think there is another element that is important for us to highlight in this situation. African member states often have felt that they got the bad part of the bargain in some of these global geopolitical discussions. If we remember in 2011, when the UN Security Council approved the no-flight zone in Libya, there was a major outcry in the continent about what impact that intervention had in the whole region, and that still reflects until today in the Sahel. That is still in the imaginary of many African politicians and member states. This fear of being used as a proxy for global political situations. And it doesn't surprise me that there's been such a split between African member states in different votes within the United Nations. There is still an evolving situation where everyone is somehow trying to position itself to ensure that, of course, there is a peace and security crisis in Ukraine and the responsibility of the United Nations to deal with that. But, and I'm just looking at some of the South African pictures now, this fear of being utilized as a proxy in a situation that Africa would have a very little say at the end of the day. And I think those two angles, neither of them is exclusive. We do have the situation where some of the countries do have special relationships with Russia. The countries do have certain sympathies and certain alignments with some of the Russian thinking. But there is also an incredible fear by many African member states of being used as a pawn within a global situation without necessarily having its voice heard, and hence they break almost in half, 26 versus 28 countries, 26 abstaining or voting against versus 28 countries that voted in favor of the resolution condemning Russia.
Yeah, if some did vote in favor to condemn Russia, I mean, a lot of persons says that's something we should commend. But on the flip side, one would wonder, Russia has been trying to cut Africa in recent years. They even have planned to summit Africa, Russia, something, I can't remember now, for later this year. So the question would be, how would these voting that we've seen affect future relationship with Russia, he being a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, actually?
When we live in a period that we are right now, where there is a strong divide amongst great global powers, it's much harder for African member states to show a degree of nuance. in the sense of there is often that expectation that you're either with us or against us. So certainly the way in which African member states are voting most likely will have a spillover effect, both in terms of the relationship with Russia, but also in terms of the relationship with the West. Certainly as the situation prolongs, this idea of a very like this dichotomy between us versus the rest is probably going to provide a certain space of maneuver that I think the more nuanced approaches will be able to gain more leverage. But I think in the short term, it's going to always be very difficult for either the countries that voted in favor or the countries that voted against or abstained in that case. And certainly the ability of these countries to provide a credible narrative that is sustained by action, that ensures that their position is not simply a position of alignment, but rather a position of sovereign decisions that ensures that their voices and interests are being heard at a global stage. Certainly some of the African member states are starting to portray this idea of a third way, of a non-alignment, and reminds me a lot of the non-aligned movements in the 60s and 70s. And in some extent, we're still yet to see whether there's going to be an appetite, especially from the countries of the global south, of ensuring this third wave that does not really place them in a fight that they have very little to contribute, and they may be affected negatively by whichever directions occurs on either of the sides.
Okay, time is not a friend, so we just might as well just wind down. I wanted to speak briefly on, just reflect on the kind of ideal future relationship or partnership you foresee for Africa and the UN, if we're to milk it, so to speak, for our own benefit?
I think there is definitely what I would like to see in the coming years is a stronger African voice and presence in the United Nations. And that means that we have to better equip our missions in New York. We need to send better diplomats. We need to coordinate better with other member states to be able to provide positions that are negotiate, that there are compromises that are made, but it's not simply a reactive position to what the global north is deciding for us. And I think for me that can only be done with the attempt of achieving unity. Unity in that sense doesn't mean that always common positions are going to be found, but really the effort and the exercise of African member states to work together with the African group in New York through the Africa Union Peace and Security Council in Addis Ababa to ensure that these positions are well thought. That for me is going to provide a lot of leverage for African member states. But I also think there is a stronger role that African member states can play in this normative side of the United Nations. We often see many discussions around the future of peacekeeping operations, or the future of the UN in mediation processes, or the future of the UN in dealing with counterterrorism. But many times you see a number of European and Northern countries sitting around the table making those decisions that feel very technical, but in fact will impact the continent in the long run. And I would like to see African member states using the leverage of the numbers, but also using the leverage around being the continent that is most severely affected by conflicts in the world right now. And that can only be done with good planning, good people, and good capacity of collaboration and negotiation within the continent, but between the continent and the rest of the international community.
I must say it's been a pleasure speaking with you, Mr. Gustavo De Carvalho. It's been a wonderful time. I hope to have you on the program again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. And I would say thank you for watching. I can only add that I am eternally optimistic about Africa and her place in the world. Please join us again next week for another Africa First conversation. Until then, please be well. Bye for now.